I'm Boyd Clayton, the Deputy Director with the Division of Water Rights. And before I start talking about my topic, I think we've talked at you long enough. Maybe it's time to find out if anything's gone in. So someone tell me, what is a water right? Oh, nobody. Looks scary. Nobody's going to take a venture at it? Okay, that's the essential. Some of the essential elements are right to divert and use water. Let me amplify that a little. It's a right to divert waters of the public and put them to a beneficial use. Okay? So how do you get a right, a water right? Been talking about this for 4 hours now.
Make an application first.
Okay, so if you want to get a new right to use water, you make an application to the state engineer. That's what's required under the statutes now. How else might you get a water right? Purchase it. So what are you purchasing if you purchase a right? So you're assuming someone else has a right and you're purchasing it from them. Is that correct? Where might they have gotten that right? Okay, so the answer's been it's been inherited and come down through the family, and ultimately the family got it from where? Too many voices. I'm not filtering well. Somebody say what you said louder.
First use.
Okay, so he said first use, so the concept is, what I think you're saying to me, is they actually acquired the right before it was required to apply to the state engineer. So that means if it's surface water, it was prior to 1903. If it's groundwater, it was prior to 1935. Or they may, and in that subset of things, there have been court decrees that recognize those uses or settled those uses between people. So you either have a decreed right, you have a right that's based on prior use that you may have recorded as a diligence claim, or the right arises through an application to appropriate with the state engineer. Before we jump into this subject, let me give you a little history so you understand where we're at and how we got here. As has been mentioned, prior to 1903, you gained a water right. There was some intricacies at different times. For a period, you had to file the location with the county recorder. For a period, you just had to go out and put it to use. And so how did you find out if you were impairing someone else's water right during that period? They came and helped you understand that, right? And it worked pretty well for a time. There was a lot of water appropriated before 1903, and you got the picture pretty clearly. But there was also another problem with that system, and that was that if you were going to expend a lot of money, it was best not to find that out after you'd expended the money and built a big elaborate system. And so that's really what led to the water rights system in 1903, was that most of the easy projects had been built. A lot of the water had been appropriated once, at least once, and there was opportunities to build bigger projects that were more expensive, but there wasn't the incentive to make those investments without a water rights system that you could more generally understood and know what might be available to appropriate. So the state engineer became a record keeper, and that's what the application process is about, is a method to keep records of water rights so that people can find out what's already righted and what may be available above what rights exist, or what rights may exist that you can go out and acquire. The method that the legislature settled on in order for that to happen was that the state engineer would start keeping records of new applications, and we would magically go out and through court adjudications bring all the other existing uses into the record. And part of it worked pretty well. We've been keeping records since 1903, and if you go up to our file room, there are files up there from those first applications in our file room, along with many others. What didn't work so well was adjudication, and we'll hear more about that a little later. And we're still working on that part of getting all the records of existing uses into a written record. But it's essential for us to move forward, as we'll talk about a little more as we move on. Initially, when the state engineer started appropriating water, he thought life was pretty simple. And so you would make application for a particular use, and he would approve that application, and you would put the water to use and perfect it. And in order to keep it simple, he even made sure that if you were applying to put water to use, which was primarily irrigation at that time, that before he approved your application, he would check to make sure that you hadn't already applied to use water in that same place before, so that you didn't have the stacking of water right applications and the uses would be true. As time went on, particularly as wells became available, then the state engineer started to move away from that system, and people started filing what are called supplemental rights. And the idea was, I have a right out of this stream that works for part of the year, but during the late part of the year there's not enough water, and so I'm going to drill this well and use that water on that same land supplementally with that other water. So what we ended up with was a system where two water rights show some of the same uses. That didn't seem too bad at first because the state was still mostly appropriating water for new uses. And so if there was water available, the state engineer typically set a limitation of you can only divert between all of your sources, all of your rights, the duty that's required to serve that land. You can't divert 10 times as much because you're not growing rice. But that was essentially the management that was going on at the time, was that recognizing that there were multiple sources or multiple rights serving a particular use. As was pointed out by Kirk Forbush this morning, in the early 80s, the first, I believe, big conversion from agricultural use to another use occurred in the state when the Intermountain Power Project was built in Delta. And at that time, they purchased a number of irrigation rights that they converted to that industrial use for IPP. And as we did that, some bigger issues started to appear on the radar. As we started to move from a system where we were basically appropriating water to a system where people were buying water rights and converting to new uses. So the water rights were becoming monetized in our system. And then it became clear that the records that maybe we hadn't been keeping as carefully on use, and there was overlap between them, were going to become a problem in the state. And so we've worked on a system to try to resolve some of the problems there. And that's what my presentation talks about today, is water use groups. So the issue with water use groups is that we have multiple water rights that may serve some of the same uses. So the goal with water use groups is to develop a system where we can reflect uniquely the uses associated with a water right. Okay? So it's really just, as we talk about this topic, it's a means that the state engineer has used to organize his records. It's an organizational structure. We implement it in our water right database. And so we talked about that the official record of the state engineer is the paper file, and we try to leave traces of water use groups on the paper file, but in reality, water use groups are mostly organized in the database records. So to understand them, you'll have to use the database records quite a bit. As I mentioned before, a water right represents a unique right to divert water, but does not always describe a unique beneficial use of that water. Each water use group represents a unique beneficial use of the water and ties together the water rights that supply that use. Okay? Because of that, because you don't have a water right if you don't have a use for the water, because that's the measure and limit of the right is the beneficial use, every water right has at least one water use group. But it may have many more than one. This is, and I don't have my glasses on, so it's really cloudy looking to me, and I don't know if it is to you too. This is a printout from our water right database that down in the tabulation of information shows water use groups. So this particular right has 4 water use groups. And I don't know, and each of those groups represents a unique use that is served by a unique set of water rights. Okay? Let me try to display that a little different way. So for instance, if we have 2 water rights, or 3 water rights, we might use those in a number of combinations. So on this map, we have an area up at the top, Group 1, which represents irrigation that's only being done by water right 1. Group 2, over to the left side, is irrigated by water right 1 and water right 2. Group 3 in the middle is irrigated by water rights 2 and 3. And group 4 is irrigated only by water right 3. So if you looked at the total irrigation for water right number 1, it would reflect the acreage in group 1 and group 2. If you looked at water right number 2, it would reflect the acreage in group 2 and group 3. If you look at water right number 3, it will reflect group 3 and group 4. So if you just looked at the water right, you might get an inaccurate picture of the uses associated solely with that water right, if that makes sense, because some water rights are being used in conjunction with all water rights, so those water rights can't claim the whole use. That's the idea. Okay? So why do we use water use groups? To account for the limits and measure of the water rights. Additionally, the water use groups become an index to the water rights that serve a use. So if I identify some place on the ground, the water use groups will help me understand what water rights might serve that ground. And thirdly, we try to use water use groups to figure out and keep some kind of understanding of exactly what all the uses are, unique uses of water that are occurring in the state. So if life was perfect, we should be able to add up all the water use groups for irrigation and get some sort of reasonable estimate of how much irrigation is occurring in the state. Now there's a couple little hitches with that, but that's the idea of why we have water use groups. Here's the hitches. First of all, when we were developing this system, we included the irrigation companies with all the private water rights. As we moved forward with that a little bit, that became pretty unpopular pretty quickly for reasons I'll describe in a minute. And so we've now uncoupled irrigation companies from water use groups with private water rights. And then public water suppliers, because their uses aren't irrigation, fit in a different class. And so what we do with public water suppliers is we combine all of the rights for that public water supplier in one water use group, because obviously their use is to serve their service area. Okay? So, if a water use group, if you're looking in our records and you find a water right owned by an individual that has water rights that are owned by an irrigation company as part of that use group, what does it mean? It means that that person or some person at some time also used shares of stock to irrigate that land. But that apparently not just the stock served that land, because there was also a private water right that was serving it. As you will learn more about irrigation companies tomorrow, I hope, then you'll understand that shares move around in companies and are not necessarily tied to particular parcels of land. So while shares of stock may have been used on this piece of land sometimes, it may not be now, because those shares move rather freely within the company. So at this point, if you find a situation like that in our water right database, you probably can conclude that's an error, because we've tried to separate those two things and talk to our staff about correcting that error and taking the irrigation company out of the water use group with a private water right. And what we will do instead is what's shown on this page, which you probably can't read either because it's so small. We will put a note in the water use group that there are also irrigation company shares that may have been used on that land at one time. But we will not try to quantify it. All right, so as we move on in this subject, then we need to understand a couple of terms. The first one is sole supply, and that may be expressed as a limit of an entire water right, of the use of an entire water right. The meaning being that that water right is the sole supply for 20 acres of irrigation, meaning by itself it can serve 20 acres. It may also refer to a limit in a water use group. So one of those water use groups may be individually limited to 20 acres under this water right. And it may have multiple water use groups, and each of those groups, that right may have a limit, a sole supply limit. A group total is an accounting tool that we're using with groups. As I showed on that diagram earlier, for a particular water use group, there is a unique acreage or piece of land that is served, or use that is served in that group. And so the group total is the total of that area in the group. The period of use is associated with a water use group, and so it specifies the period of use that those water rights can be used for that use. And then place of use is also associated with the group, and it identifies the 40s or acreage within 40s that are in that part of that group. As you try to understand water use groups, there are a number of sources on the file that can be useful in helping to understand that. There's typically information on the application to appropriate, the original documents that created the right on our records, whether it's an application to appropriate, a diligence or underground water claim, a certificate of beneficial use, a decree, or a published proposed determination that we'll find more about tomorrow. There may also be maps on the file that give some hints about where the water was used supplementally with other rights that will help you understand water use group. Why do you care, and what does this have to do with you? Let's get to that issue. Why we use water use groups? Because it will be a key indicator of the value when you acquire a water right. For instance, although a water right may claim in its uses that it's used to irrigate 1,200 acres, as you examine the water use groups, it may be limited to 4 acres out of that 1,200 acres. And so there's a vastly different value between a water right that can serve 4 acres and a water right that can serve 1,200 acres. So it's something to be very aware of and make sure that you understand. It will clearly be an issue you will have to reconcile when you file a change application. This is why. Oftentimes when rights were developed supplementally, they were all owned by the same person. So the person got a water right for a use, figured out he didn't have enough water from that source, got another water right from another source that he used there, and then added a little more acreage. Then he got another water right and did the same thing. And so he kind of built this piggyback system initially. And then as those water rights started to become more valuable as we have closed areas to appropriation, he started selling off pieces of that water right or those water rights. And so over time, various parties own a part of those uses. So when you go to file a change application, you obviously can only change what you own. And so understanding the water use groups will become critical to understanding what uses are associated with the water right you own and can now change. And then, as we will talk about in just a second, as you quantify the uses in a water use group, they become a limit if you separate those rights. So if, as I mentioned, you buy one of the rights a farmer owned when he was going through this aggregating business and then started to sell off, you decide to take your water right and go do something else with it, what your water right and his water rights are limited to after that separation occurs is critical and depends on how those water use groups are developed. As I mentioned before, this really did not become an issue that was big on our radar until about 1980. And our initial efforts at starting to develop supplemental right groups, as we called them, began sometime a little bit after that. And then as it became even a bigger issue, we modified that system and have a more robust system in place today. But it's gone through a couple of iterations of development, and in those iterations, errors have been perpetuated as we have moved from the simplest system to the most complex. And there are a number of situations where water use groups are not fully developed. Let me explain what I mean by that. As we talked about before, if a farmer layered those rights, at the time he did that, the state engineer was not necessarily requiring him to identify each of those groups and how much acreage was associated with each of the groups, even though there were several there. And so as we've come back, we initially identified that all of those rights were supplemental to each other. Then at another level, we started to identify with each of those rights what other rights were with it, but we were doing them independent of each other. And now the system that we used, all the rights have to show the same thing so that you can see them from either end. That probably is a little more information than you need. Anyway, so as you look at our records, you may find an error. If something looks not quite right, it's fair to ask our office to review a water use group. If you'll tell us why you think there's an error, that would be helpful, because water use groups are still a work in progress in our office. Okay, that's probably the message I need to get to you. Is there a work in progress, and you're going to help us solve part of our problem over time. So as you are reviewing a water right and are trying to look at it to file a change or whatever, if you look at a water use group and something doesn't look quite right, as you look at it, please document what doesn't look right and contact our office and ask us to review it, and we will do that. A water right group contains the place of use, the period of use, and the beneficial uses that are associated with that group. It also contains the water rights and each of their contribution to that use. Water use groups can be dynamic, meaning that if you own all the uses in a group, you can designate within parameters that aren't violated with the water rights current definition how the uses should be allocated among the rights in that group. So for instance, if I have a group that irrigates 60 acres and I have 3 water rights, if there isn't other information that indicates only 20 acres are associated with water right A, 10 acres with B, and 30 with C, you can allocate those uses among the rights within that group any way you want, as long as it fits within the parameters that are already defined in that right. So you can make a declaration to our office and tell us, this is how I want those water rights groups uses to be allocated. You do that with what we call a declaration of beneficial use. Then you could come back a few years later and decide, I didn't really mean to do it that way. So you can submit another declaration of beneficial use and tell us this is how we really should have allocated those uses between those rights. As long as it's consistent with the water rights, you can do that. That's what I mean by it can be dynamic over time. One of the options you can choose is that you can declare any water right that you own has zero contribution to the beneficial uses in a group. Why would you do that? There may be reasons, because you want to make life simpler, so you just want to take this water right out of that water use group. If you do that, and you can submit a declaration just for one water right on one water use group and designate that its contribution to that group is zero. If you do that, that is a binding decision. You don't get to remake that decision. So make that choice carefully. Okay? There's a reason that we've done that, because we've established rules about how to work with water use groups. And I didn't mention that at the beginning. But I was going to ask you, what is a statute? I heard somebody over there whisper, it's a law made by the legislature and signed by the governor or overridden by the legislature. So it's a legislative law. Well, I'm not going there. What's an administrative rule? Okay, no. Well, sort of, his appointee. So administrative rule is something that the legislature decided they didn't want to get worn out on, and so they've delegated authority to a state agency to make a rule. Okay, and so if you make an administrative rule, they're always subject to legislative review, and they can terminate the rule if they don't like it. And they're reviewed on a regular cycle to see if the rules are still needed. But a rule has the same force as law until the legislature decides it doesn't. Okay? And so water use groups our agency generally tries not to use administrative rule because water rights are a difficult enough topic that it's better for the legislature to declare how it works than for us to make rules and have people continually going to the legislature to get those rules killed. So we generally don't create much rule. Almost all of the operation of our agency is under statute. In the case of water use groups, because it's an accounting mechanism that we're trying to use to keep our water rights system together, we elected to create some rules to manage water use groups. And so they are created under rule. And so what so under that rule, we created 3 things that can happen with water use groups. The first one is the one I indicated earlier, that you can look at our records, and if you believe the water use group information we have on our record does not look correct, you can, in writing, request us to review that. And we will review it and correct it if something's incorrect. Second thing you can do is you can submit to our office a declaration of beneficial use amounts in a group, water use group, which declares how those uses should be allocated among the water rights in that group. The third thing you can do, because in order to submit a declaration, all the people who own all those water rights have to sign the declaration. So there has to be agreement with everyone who owns the water rights in a water use group in order to submit a declaration. Okay. The third thing you can do, if you've pounded your head on the wall and can't get a declaration done, is you can submit a request for the state engineer to go in and apportion the uses among the rights in that group. That's the least favored option to us. We'd rather the people who own the rights decide it. But there are reasons why that may be necessary. For instance, as was mentioned earlier, the ownership on water rights aren't always up to date, and you may find that one of those water right owners is dead. It's hard to get them to sign anything. And so you may just hit a brick wall and can't find an owner that's in a use group. And so your only option may be to request an apportionment. So let's talk a little more about just what all this means, because I think I'm still talking a little vaguely, and I'm not sure if we're getting the subject, but I'm hoping so. How am I doing on time, by the way? I'm moving slowly. Got to move faster. So the beneficial use amount is the amount of beneficial use a water right contributes to a group. And it means the same thing as a group contribution. We use those two terms interchangeably in our office. So declaration issues, the whole reason we have gone to this system, when we first started doing supplemental groups, our office was in the business of trying to divine how those uses should be separated among the rights in the group. And we did that till about 2010, I believe, somewhere right in then. About in that time, we started to realize that that wasn't a very good thing for our office to be doing, because we didn't own any of the rights, and we were deciding which rights would end up with which uses. And so that's when we created this rule and started putting the burden back on the owners of the right to resolve this problem among those who shared the uses, since it was tied to the value of the right. And so the biggest problem that you may have in trying to do a declaration of beneficial use is identifying the owners, other owners of rights. If you buy a part of a water right from someone, there's a good chance it may be shared with others in a water use group. And that's one of the things you want to look at, because you won't be able to file a change until those uses are quantified in the water use group. If the beneficial use amounts are defined, the water right can be segregated. That means you can apply with our office to have a part of that water right separated to a new water right number, which you can then do other things with the right. Until those uses are quantified in the group, it's not that easy. So when do you need to file a group contribution form? If you're going to do a segregation on a water right, then you need to look at the water use groups and see if the uses in those groups have been quantified between the rights that are part of that group. If they haven't, then you'll need to do a declaration to resolve that. If you need to file a change application and aren't changing all of the rights that are in the use groups that are involved in those rights, then you'll need to do the same thing. As I mentioned, you need to make written requests for corrections. You file declarations of beneficial use based on a form that we use in our office. And then, as I mentioned, if that doesn't work, you can request that we do an apportionment. To let you know, there's a lot of process involved in apportionment, and it will take time to do that if that's what you want to do, because our process will be to go out and request that all the water right owners that are involved in those uses tell us what they think their water right, how they think it should be apportioned. And then we will take all of that information and review the records ourselves and then try to divine an answer, and then we'll publish that to everyone and give everyone an opportunity to come back and comment about how we got it wrong. So it's a long process if you have to end up in an apportionment, or it can be. So as I mentioned, the best thing to do is, if you're in this situation, is to get with the other water right owners that share your beneficial use group and come to agreement among yourselves about how it should be divided. That's too small to see, so let's just get out of here. And I'm running out of time, so I'll skip that. I wanted to get to the website really quickly here. Oh, there it is. To just show you something. So if I go to a water right, I meant to think of one good one here. Let's see what I get randomly here. I got a water right. It's only got one use group in it. All right. You can see on this water right that it has one water right group. A supplemental group is the same as a water use group. And in this case, there are 30 stock units. That's the uses of this water right, so it only has one water use group. I was trying to think of, I had this one here. Hang on. All right, here is a water right that has multiple use groups. You can see the first group, there is only one water right in the group, and the uses are just for 67 animals. The second use group has two water rights in the group, and they're used together for cooling of milk. And it's an unevaluated quantity of the use. The third use group is for irrigation, and it has 4 water rights in that use group. And altogether, those 4 rights irrigate 36.88 acres. But how much this water right contributes to that use has not yet been evaluated. So if I wanted to file a change application to convert irrigation from this right to another use, before we would allow you to file the change application, then you would have to evaluate how much of that use, irrigation use, belongs to this right. And the way you would do that would be to file a declaration. So if I go up here under this water right on the pull down and go down here to Declaration of Beneficial Use Amounts, it will bring up this page with all kinds of things to say. And then down at the bottom, it'll say Get Group Numbers. And so you'll want to select that group, which I didn't remember which one it was, but I believe it was this one. And then if you hit Generate a Declaration, it will bring up this document. That wasn't the one. Let's try again. Sorry, I'm losing my marbles. So we'll try this one. Interestingly enough, that group is declared, but we'll use that as an example. So when it brings up this water use group, it will identify each of the water rights and the amount that they contribute to this use. In this case, this group has been declared, so someone has gone through and decided that 6.6 acres are associated with this first water right, 4.8 with the second one, 15.9 with the third, and 0.7, and then interestingly enough, they've decided that none of the uses should be associated with that last water right. So those uses need to total up to the same amount as the group total. And then down at the bottom, there will be a page, and in this case, the same entity owns all those water rights, so this one is an easy one to declare. The people who own the water rights, there will be an endorsement section for each owner of the water rights, and each of them has to sign it, and then you submit it to our office. In this case, it's only owned by one entity. But if you brought the water use group up and these numbers weren't defined, then that's what your work would be to say how much each of the water rights should have of this total group use, and then you would submit that to our office with the signatures. That's what water use groups are about, and the goal is to have the unique amounts of use with each water right defined, so that as you file change applications, we know how much of the uses go with that particular water right, since several water rights are serving the same uses. That's the big picture of water use groups. Are there any questions? You've had enough. Good. I have too. I will tell you, if you're involved in water rights, you'll run into water use groups. And I would just encourage you, if you're struggling with it, come in and see our public inquiry folks, and they'll help you figure out how to work through it. But it's an important facet of understanding a water right, because the uses are the limit of the right in the end. Thank you.